So I'm gonna, oh, great. Thanks for starting the recording. I'm gonna put up a slide on logistics, and I'm gonna share my whole desktop. So hopefully that'll work. So I'm not gonna put it into presentation mode just yet. But can folks see that?
Yes.
Yeah, it looks great.
Yes, for me.
Yes. Okay, so the first item here is if there's anyone that needs, I put a link to the Slack in the chat, but please let me know if you're not able to get into that. I think everybody received an invitation. And I also put a link to the instructions that we'll be going through in the chat. So please let me know if you don't have access to that. If you haven't already done so, we posted the instructions yesterday, but you can go ahead and start working through the setup steps to get the Docker desktop installed, to download the container and set up the volumes that you'll need to work through the examples. You can do that during the presentations if you haven't already, so that'll give you more time to actually work on the simulations. And if possible, if you've gotten to this point, you can open two containers in your terminal or PowerShell windows. Well, I think we'll need one to run the simulation and one to do the plotting. So it's more efficient to have two, and see step 6 in the document for more detail about how to do that. And then please do use the Slack channel. We have a thread there for introduction, since we won't have time to go around the whole room here. Please, a number of folks have already done so. Introduce yourself in that thread if you would like. Just a few sentences about yourself, your interests, and what you hope to get out of this. I'd also like to try to use the Slack for troubleshooting issues that folks are running into. We can help each other. Those of us who have gotten it to work, since Faria and I can't be everywhere, we can, I think, help each other. And just a note that these are developing workflows, things that we've just kind of gotten up and running for this hackathon. We are very open to helpful suggestions about how to make it better, or additional things we might want to include in the future. So before I launch into the introductory slides about ELM and our model testbed, I'll stop and pause and see if there's any burning questions or trouble that folks have run into and want to address first. All right. And then please do use the Slack for those questions as we move forward. So I'm going to try to put this into full screen mode. Please bear with me a second. Oops, that's not good. Can folks still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great. Okay, so do you see the presentation?
Yes.
Screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about ELM, and what we're using here within the Docker framework is OLMT, or the offline model testbed. And then Faria will present on the American River watershed and the data on the simulations that we'll be running through the examples today. So just a very brief introduction to the model. So ELM is part of the Energy Exascale Earth System Model, or E3SM, which was initiated by DOE in, I believe, 2014, and first kind of released to the public in April 2018. We're running version 2 of that model now in terms of coupled experiments, and I think version 3, they're working on freezing that code pretty soon. So the ELM, or the E3SM land model, branched from community land model version 4.5, and since then a number of improvements have been made, including introduction of phosphorus cycling, plant hydraulics, two-way coupling with a Mozart river model, topographic units, and then continuing work on the FATES dynamic vegetation model. And so part of the reason I think we're here today is that there are quite a few ESS investments geared towards, or one of the purposes of those is to improve the predictability in the land model through MODEX, or integrating these models and experiments together. For example, with NGEE Arctic, NGEE Tropics, data from Spruce, Ameriflux, and the COMPASS projects, among others. And hopefully what we can do here with these implementations is make the model more accessible for folks that aren't necessarily part of the formal E3SM project, and develop some workflows for MODEX that will enable actually improving model parameters and predictions using sources of data. So ELM is just one component of E3SM, which is a full Earth system model. So it also has atmosphere model, ocean, land and sea ice, and the river model that are connected through a coupler. Today, we're focused on ELM here, and a version of ELM that doesn't use the coupler, but is forced directly with atmospheric data. ELM's hydrology is relatively simple. It's a 1D Richards equation formulation, so there's no lateral connectivity. We have in the model 10 soil layers that get progressively thicker as you go down, all the way down to 3.8 meters. And then there's 5 additional layers of bedrock that go down to 35 meters. And it represents all sort of major processes in the grid cell in terms of plant transpiration, evaporation, through fall, and then surface and subsurface runoff. It also has a snow model and tracks water table. On the biogeochemistry side, we have 6 major plant pools. And so in a particular model grid cell, there can be up to 17 plant functional types. And for those, we have leaf, live and dead stem, live and dead coarse root, and fine root pools. And for all of those, we track carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And then below ground in the soil, we have in those same 10 soil layers, we're tracking soil organic matter. The default version of ELM has 4 pools with varying turnover times, 3 litter pools, and a coarse woody debris pool. So what's in an ELM grid cell? So as I mentioned, there's no lateral connectivity here. So what that means is that it's kind of arbitrary at what resolution we can run at. We can go all the way down to 1 kilometer, which is what we'll be doing today for a relatively small region. Global simulations, typically they range from about 1/4 degree to 1 degree, or 25 to 100 kilometers. But we can set up, if we're running the model offline, driving it with forcing data, we can use either rectangular or unstructured grids. And those unstructured grids need not be contiguous, given there's no lateral connectivity. What we'll be running today is an unstructured grid, but contiguous over the American River watershed. And so there's a lot of subgrid heterogeneity that can be represented within an ELM grid cell. This is a relatively old graphic, so since this graphic has been created, there's also another level in between grid cell and land unit, which is a topographic unit. So we can have multiple elevations represented, elevation classes represented in a grid cell. And then the major land units are vegetation, lake, urban, glacier, and crop. Each of those can sit on a soil column where we do the hydrology and all the subsurface stuff. And so if we're looking at the PFTs, so you can have multiple plant functional types sitting on what's called the natural vegetation land unit, where essentially those PFTs are occupying different parts of that grid. So they don't compete for light above ground, but they sit on the same soil column. So they do compete for water and nutrients below ground. So then a little bit about the offline model testbed or OLMT that we'll be using today. So that's an automated framework for running ELM simulations, and I'll go through in a little bit more detail what it's doing. We can use it for multiple versions of the model. We've done so recently. So ELM SP or satellite phenology, BGC, which does the full biogeochemistry, we'll be using today. There's also a crop version, a version that uses fates, and it could be used for CLM5 as well, although we haven't, that would require a little bit of additional development, but CLM5 uses the same underlying infrastructure. We can use this framework for single site simulations, multiple sites, and regional global. So today we'll be focusing on these regional simulations, and running these full sort of biogeochemistry simulations can be quite complex because we have to worry about spinning up the carbon and nutrient pools to steady state, generally using pre-industrial forcings. So there's two phases of that spin up. So an accelerated decomposition and then a regular spin up, both generally running for several hundred years. And then those we initialize at 1850 to start the transient run, during which we can have CO2 concentrations changing over time, land use, nitrogen deposition, and climate. So in order to run a simulation, we have the following requirements. And so we have what's called the surface data, which contains information including soil texture, location, and the plant functional type distributions that are in each grid cell. And we also need input driver data, so the atmospheric or meteorological data. Depending on what we want, if we're running single site simulations, we can use Ameriflux, tower observations, gap fill drivers, or other sort of direct surface observations. If we're running regional simulations, typically we use some kind of reanalysis data. We've used mainly GSWP3 in the past, but there are several out there. And so today, since we're focused on a higher sort of higher resolution than standard reanalysis products provide, we have a DayMet, basically a version of DayMet that's temporally downscaled using the GSWP3 reanalysis at 1 kilometer. There are also other time varying inputs that come. Typically, we just use the global data sets where we can in terms of nitrogen deposition. Inputs to the wildfire model include lightning and population density, also CO2 concentrations, which typically we use sort of global average values. OLMT can also allow for scaling or manipulation of these model inputs. We can run multiple sites together, or today, regional or global simulations. So OLMT is based on something called the coupling infrastructure for modeling Earth, or CEAM, which is used in both E3SM and CESM or CTSM. So that's a Python-based infrastructure, basically, that handles a lot of the underlying infrastructure the model needs to run. So the scripting, some of the code involved with the data models and the coupler, machine support, so specific configurations for running on different supported machines, unit testing, and mapping utilities. And so typically, if we didn't have OLMT, then we would have to use the CEAM infrastructure to run, which is generally, if you're running sort of a scientifically supported global simulation, it's relatively simple to do that. And there's a quick start guide there linked for how one might start sort of a coupled simulation. But as it turns out, if we want to run sort of a custom domain or single site or a region, it's actually quite difficult in order to set up everything we need. So the first step typically is to get the code, which is already included here today in the Docker. And then you would go into the code and navigate to the scripts directory and perform these steps where we create something called a model case. And set that up and compile and submit. So there's a couple of different things that are associated with creating that case. So one of them being a comp set or component set. And so those are quite a large number of these within E3SM, and there's a specific sort of structure for how what all of these variables mean. For what we're interested in and what OLMT uses, we have what are called I comp sets. So anything that starts with an I, and this alias here means offline land, so no coupled ocean or atmosphere. And then we have a time period associated with the simulation, pre-industrial, present day, or transient, and then how exactly what components of each submodel that we want. And so if we're running an offline land configuration, you can use something called data atmosphere, where it reads the reanalysis or forcing data and passes that through the coupler, or we can use SATM, which is a stub model, and enable what we're using here is coupler bypass. And so that we have code within the ELM model directly that can directly read the reanalysis data. And it turns out that's a little bit more efficient of a way to run these offline land simulations, because it avoids some bottlenecks that we see in DATM with passing that data every time step versus having it all in the memory. And then there's a lot of different configurations of ELM itself in terms of the kind of the nutrients, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. You can turn off or turn on various combinations of those. Relative demand, these are associated with below ground or decomposition models and competition between plants and microbes for nutrients. And so each, at the bottom here, each phase of the simulation of the spin-ups and transient simulations that I mentioned, each one of those uses a new case and comp set. And so if we're wanting to go in and customize a case, there's a large number of potential combinations of options that may or may not be covered by comp sets. And so we need to customize them in order to do that. So if you want to turn on fire, or you want to change specific options or parameters, then one would need to edit some of these files in the case directory. Basically, or the nameless files generally is the way that it's done. So sort of trying to motivate the need for this OLMT framework. What it does is basically it automates a lot of those seam steps to enable running these ELM simulations with a single command line call to the script. So this kind of customization of model options, a number of those can be just set as flags when we're running using OLMT, without having to know exactly where to look for things and the syntax for doing these modifications. And then another thing is running a single site or running a new region requires, without OLMT, would require defining a whole new resolution. So you'll see if you look deeply into the E3SM code, there are a number of supported resolutions, globally gridded or different spatial resolutions, but also like if you wanting to run at a single site, you would see like 1x1 underscore and then some name. So it's very time consuming to go through that and do this for every new site or region you might want to run. So OLMT is configured to do this kind of on the fly as necessary, and it will manage these three simulation phases or cases. And then it also has some infrastructure for setting up, managing, and post-processing model ensembles. We won't be talking too much about ensembles today, but it does do also some plotting and visualization for us. And then for folks that are interested, we could talk a little bit more towards the end about uncertainty quantification, where we're running ensembles of model simulations with different parameters. Here, I think today we'll have one example where we just change one parameter and look at what effects that might have. Just a little bit more a visual representation of if we're wanting to run ensembles, how it does that. So a little bit about why we want to use we're wanting to use the Docker implementation today for this hackathon. And so I think the number one reason, or one of the main reasons, is accessibility. And so we've had a lot of collaborators that want to get E3SM or ELM up and running on a new machine. And so if you're not working on, or if you don't have access to one of the sort of officially supported machines that are used by the project, it can be quite difficult to set up the environments, the libraries, and the right combinations of compilers and libraries to get everything working correctly. And so the container that folks have developed already that we're taking advantage of today has everything needed to run E3SM successfully on multiple platforms. It can be, folks running on their desktops or laptops, generally we don't have a whole lot of processors available. So we're not going to be able to run these regional simulations very quickly. But an advantage is we don't necessarily have to worry about long queue times if we're running on a cluster, and we can quickly build, compile the model and run kind of short tests. Efficient analysis and visualization. And then for folks that are interested in sort of taking this and running on NERSC or other machines, I've included some scripts for running some of these same examples there, where we can run on a much larger number of processors and get the model done faster. So just quick summary of OLMT. So it simplifies some of these steps required by SIEM and allows us to customize site level simulations or regional simulations that we're running here, and visualization and uncertainty quantification. And then I will pause here. I will put these slides into the Slack so folks can actually access these links, but some additional information about E3SM, OLMT, and then the fast simulation framework that we're using today. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. That was used at the NG Arctic MODEX workshop last fall, that they have some examples for running some of these single site simulations in Alaska for folks that are interested. So we'll have a couple minutes for questions.
Hello. Hi, Dave.
Hello. Sorry,
So I'm wondering, so you mentioned the Docker container can allow us to run the whole E3SM, right? Instead of just ELM.
So yes, it contains all of the model code.
Yes,
now I haven't
all the model code, but the
Yes.
executable is for the whole E3SM.
Yeah, so you could, right, if you're wanting to run a different comp set that contains coupled simulation, you could do so, although I think it would be quite slow.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Dan. I have a question about the ensemble runs that are implemented in OLMT. So does that also allow, say, multiple scenarios, like the different forcing products and all that, or it's mostly focusing on parameter ensembles?
Right, right now it's set up to, manipulate parameters.
Okay.
There are some surface data properties we could manipulate as well. Like if you're running satellite phonology, then you could manipulate LAI. But yeah, I mean, we could, if people have needs for that, we could think about adding new capabilities.
Okay, great, thank you.
If there's no other questions, we can move on to Faria's presentation.
Yeah, let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Looks good.
Okay, cool. So hello, everyone. I'm Faria. I'm a postdoctoral research associate at the Pacific Northwest National Lab. And in my presentation, I'll share some overview on the watershed that we'll be simulating today and how the input data was processed for the simulation. So the watershed we'll be simulating today is the American River watershed, and it's located in the Washington state. You can see this red polygon here inside the huge Columbia River basin. And here is a zoomed picture of the watershed. So the American River watershed, it has an area of 206 square kilometers, and this watershed experiences an average annual precipitation of 860 millimeters. The elevation ranges between 900 to 2,000 meters inside this watershed, as you can see in this plots, and the vegetation type covering the watershed is mostly native evergreen tree, and there are some pixels that are sea-tree grass Arctic. To do the ELM simulation, as Dan already mentioned, you need some domain and surface data sets. So at first I downloaded the global domain and surface data sets that were later downscaled for the watershed simulation. The global domain and surface data sets are available through these URLs, and they are also available on NERSC. Yeah, I can share my slides later on Slack so that you can access these URLs and see if you can find the data. So the domain file, it contains the latitudes and longitudes of the grid cell centers and the vertices, whereas the surface file contains all the surface data such as vegetation type, soil properties, topography, monthly leaf area index, etc. The resolution for the domain file that I downloaded is 2.5 degrees by 1.9 degrees, and the surface dataset resolution is 1.25 by 0.9 degrees, which is too coarse for a watershed level analysis. As you can see in this plot here, I'm showing an example of elevation from the global surface data, and you see that only one pixel is, only one grid cell is covering this whole watershed. So we need to downscale this data to our watershed domain. And for that, I used a Python script that is available on GitHub, which would do this downscaling process. And this script would the user have to provide the latitude and longitude boundary for the watershed domain, and then it would downscale the data to 1 kilometer resolution domain data set and surface data set. And this script creates 1D unstructured grid. So we used 1D unstructured because it gives the user some flexibility to work with irregular watersheds, but one can use 2D structured grids as well. Once the surface data is 1 kilometer surface data is created, we populate this. We populate the grids in the surface data set with the nearest neighbor values for all the variables from the global data set. And as you see, like this watershed is located inside one grid cell. All the pixels inside this, all the grid cells in the watershed would be populated with values from just one grid cell. So this would not capture all the variation that exists in the watershed in terms of topography or the vegetation properties, etc. So we updated this downscale surface data set with high resolution data. So the variables we updated had involved some soil properties that includes percentage of clay, percent of sand, and organic matter density for all the 10 soil layers in the surface data. And this data comes from Soil Grid. The land cover data was updated with data from MODIS, which includes vegetation type, the monthly LAI, SAI, monthly canopy top and bottom, the percentage of different type of land cover. And we also updated the topographic information that includes elevation, standard deviation of elevation, and slope. And here's just an example showing the elevation from the global surface data and the 1 kilometer elevation that we later use to update our surface data set. And lastly, we need to provide the meteorological forcing to do the simulations. So for our today's workshop, we'll be using DayMet data. So DayMet provides daily met forcing at 1 kilometer resolution, and ELM requires sub-daily met forcing. So that's why this daily data was temporarily downscaled to 3 hourly forcing based on GSWB3 data. And this data includes precipitation, total incident solar radiation, long wave radiation, temperature, wind, specific humidity, and pressure. So if anyone uses NARS, there are a lot of options for meteorological forcing. There is also NLDAS, which has hourly meteorological data, but it's coarser compared to this DayMet data. It's like 12 kilometers. So below are some plots for the precipitation data. On left, I'm showing the monthly precipitation between 1980 to 2014, which is the duration for our simulation period. So this is how the data looks like. And on right, I'm showing an example of how the precipitation data looks like for the watershed domain for a random hour during our simulation period. So yeah, that's pretty much all about how the data was processed in short. So let me know if you have any questions on this. Thank you.
Faria, could you talk a little bit more about how you generated unstructured grids?
Unstructured grids?
Yeah.
So, okay, so the Python script, it has multiple steps. Like first, it downloads the global grid cell, which is structured, and then the user would provide the minimum and maximum latitudes and longitudes boundaries surrounding the watershed bounding box, and then this would use the script would use the global domain and surface data as a template, and then it would so it basically, so it's the domain data, as I mentioned, it's like 1.9 by 2.5. So the script would create grid cell centers that are, 1 kilometer apart, and then it would produce the an 1D array of latitudes, 1D array of longitudes, something like that. And then for the surface data, it also uses the same latitudes and longitude array, and then it finds the from the pixel. So for each pixel for each 1 kilometer resolution pixel, it would look for the distance surrounding that pixel and figure out which grid cell has the shortest distance from it, and then get the variable data from that to the downscale data. And create an 1D array in that way.
But it's still 1 km resolution, but just in a structured way.
Yeah, right. It's unstructured. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to say, I think this workflow for setting up like regional unstructured grids sounds super useful for a lot of different applications. So I think like if you're willing to share some examples of that, or if there's some pathway to integrating that with OLMT moving forward, it seems like it would be a super useful tool to have out there.
Yeah, thank you. So I don't have any examples to show today, but yeah, so I'll share this slides in Slack so that people can take a look at the workflow to generate this.
So what are the underlying 1 kilometer PFT and soil data? Where were those from again?
Mm-hmm. So those are from MODIS and SoilGrid. So yeah, so a teammate in our PNNL group, he generated all this high resolution data for Columbia River Basin, and from there I extracted for just for our watershed. Yeah, there are a lot of processing that goes into into generating that.
Yeah, so for the input meteorologies, the DAMET GSWP3 merge product, those are, I think those have already been created for all of North America. But so we've just pulled that out for the American River watershed. And so that's included in the package of input data that folks are downloading. But the whole data set is something like 40 or 50 terabytes, right? So it's huge. And I think it would be great to have a workflow for extracting, you know, any region of interest there as well. And I know that's something that Fengming is working on. Other questions on either presentation?
So I guess I can stop sharing my screen if there are no questions right now.
Okay, yeah, I think for the rest of the time, it's going to be pretty informal. And so hopefully folks are working through the steps in the document. I guess I can pause and say if is there anyone that's having trouble getting the actual Docker container installed? Xingyuan?
Dan
Yeah.
and Faria, I'm wondering, before we head into that, working session, can we ask everyone to turn on their cameras, and then we take a screenshot to see who's here and have a copy of that?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. Well, thanks. Then everyone, could you please just turn on your, video for a minute, and then we just take a group photo. And I need to figure out, yeah, let me change my view as well. Great. So nice to see all of you here. And is Forrest back? We're going to miss him. Well, let's take one first, and then we'll probably PS him in later. So are you ready? 1, 2, 3, go. Smile. 1, 2, 3, go. We're all good. Thank you. Back to you, Dan and Faria.
Did you put us all on one screen?
Yeah, I changed my setting to like allow 49 photos appear on one screen.
Yeah, I was just gonna pause here and see if anyone was having trouble with the first 6 steps in the document. Everyone has a reasonably fast connection. I think the input data are about a gigabyte compressed. So I could talk a little bit about what's in there. So that's basically step 6, where we download the input data into the volume. And so that is coming from, we basically have a script that just wgets the relevant files from the E3SM input data repository on the Argon machine chrysalis. And so if you look at the entire input data directory structure for E3SM, it's in the tens of terabytes. And a lot of that is these reanalysis forcing data sets, even at half degree. The whole time series can be multiple terabytes. So what we're just getting the files that are relevant for this particular simulation. It will also enable, so I did not include the single site sort of Ameriflux tower simulations, but those aren't very big. So if people are interested in doing that, we can modify this script to go out and grab some of those site data. And I think at the ESSPI meeting in May, there'll be another breakout that's more focused on some of these site level simulations. Is that right, Ben and Pamela?
Yeah, sorry. Were you asking about the ESSPI meeting?
Yeah, I was just mentioning that I think will be on some of these site level simulations.
Yeah, we're still like organizing the specific agenda for that, but we're gonna have like a 2-hour breakout session where we're also gonna try to show some demos of this type of, yeah, like Docker based single point simulation runs. And I think we may be using a like web-based interface that Pamela has been setting up. So yeah, I guess Pamela, if you want to say anything about that aspect of it.
Yeah, no, I guess there's not really a lot to say. We're sort of adapting this so that we can have a simple web-based interface that can kind of guide people through sort of the basic steps and pull from some of these data that are on our clusters. And so it'll be sort of through a web-based interface, a cloud type thing. So you don't have to use your own compute or do any of these prep steps, hopefully.
Thanks. So this high resolution regional domain has basically the custom surface and domain files and meteorology. If folks are wanting to run sort of single point runs, either we'll have the tower based meteorology data, or on a system that has access to the full sort of half degree reanalysis data sets, OLMT is set up so that you can give it a lat lon and it will pull the surface data and the domain files from sort of the global half degree gridded files. And then you can use either site observations or the reanalysis data to drive that. Yeah, Rich.
For what you just mentioned, Dan, is that like the make metadata flags and either site full run.py or run case.py? I forget which one.
So so that part's not fully automated. So folks wanting to run, there's a additional set of steps. If it's not a tower we've already processed, that they can generate the ELM forcing files from that. Or if you already have, like, for example, the GSWP3 reanalysis data on your system, then it'll just automatically pull that site from the global data set when it's running.
Okay, thanks.
So I'll just share this download input data script to show you real briefly what it's doing. Can folks see that?
Yeah.
So basically it's going through, you can see the first line. So if you wanted to get the Ameriflux data, you could uncomment that line. So then it's grabbing the what's called the coupler bypass version of these DayMet data for the American River watershed. And then other atmospheric inputs include aerosol, CO2, lightning, and topographic forcing data. So for those, it is getting the global data sets we typically use in global simulations. So we'll automatically pull the right domain or the right locations from those files when it's running. And then it's grabbing these surface data. So the first one there is for the half-degree global gridded data set, which would give you that capability to sort of pull out points. And then the second one is the American River that Faria discussed. Model parameters. So there's just one netcdf file that contains, I think it's about 250 parameters, and in the instructions, I think somewhere towards the bottom, there's a link to a Google Doc that has the name, description, and range of values for all of those parameters. Of course, they're not all used in every configuration of the model. And so what I'm hoping to do in the near term is sort of highlight which ones might be useful for folks to get started with, or some of the more sensitive parameters. And then the domain data, which we discussed, mapping data, nitrogen deposition, population density. Those are, again, those global data sets that we use. So those can be used for not just this region, but other simulations as well. And then, so what we're doing in this example is we are actually initializing, so this last file here, we're initializing the run with a restart file that we've already done, or already run over on NERSC, because running the full spin up and transient simulations, order 1,000 years, would take way too long to run on a Docker, but we can start from 1980 and run sort of the transient period over which we have the DayMet forcing data. So it runs from 1980 to 2014. And so that's grabbing that initial file there. Any questions in general on input data or input data requirements?
Dan, I have
Yes.
a question about how do we keep up with the updating data product? Let's say if this has an update, do we have to update the link ourselves, or like you also check all those most recent versions for all these data sets?
Yeah, you could probably see from a lot of the timestamps on those files that a lot of them are relatively old. So typically, yeah, as the model evolves, sometimes new variables are added to the surface data or something like that. And then we can update that. Typically, if those files are needed by OLMT, we'll update the code there. But I don't have any sort of automated way to grab these input data. So we could think about putting that directly into the workflow, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
So ELM or E3SM does have a check. So when you build a case and submit it, it will go out and look for any missing input data files. But for some of these that we're doing, we're sort of bypassing some of that structure with OLMT. So it's not checking all of those. Terry.
Hey, Dan, to follow up with Xingyuan's question, and then what you said about no automated way to update data, how would users know that it had been updated, and if they needed to rerun with the new data that is now available? this is all tracking issues to come.
Yeah, I guess one of the issues is that we have now, like ELM has so many different versions. And so, for example, NG Arctic has branched and they're running typically with their version, and we have one for Spruce. And so, yeah, some of these branches are kept up to date with the E3SM master as it's developed in that project. And some of them are, lag behind the latest developments by years, so we have to consider exactly, what each version of the model needs. And so a lot of that is maintained in the sort of the E3SM repository through comp sets. And for each comp set, there'll be like a list of the required input files. So I think we can take advantage of that to some degree.
Seems like we opened just a perfect topic for the cyber infrastructure meeting, I guess. How do we keep up with all those versions and get users say informed all that? And Terry, and we can probably talk more afterwards too.
So does anyone have the simulation running at this point?
I have like a couple of years done, and I tried to run the plotting script, but it didn't produce any output. But it might be because I took out the satellite. Do you have to compare two different simulations for that plotting script to work? Because I skipped the downloading okay.
Yeah.
Because it put some NC files in a plotting directory, but it didn't put any images, and it didn't produce any errors either.
So it should go into let me show folks how to sort of navigate the output.
Yeah, like, I don't like, do you think you could maybe just share your screen and show like how the plotting part of it should look?
Yes. I will just go ahead and share my whole desktop. Okay, hopefully folks can see that. So if I go to tools, OLMT, now I've already downloaded the SP version of the data. So I can start with this one. Run that here. Oh, and I didn't. I'm going to have to install this again. Just give it another minute. So you can look in the volumes, you can navigate to the output and then data. And then the output is being generated under the seam_run directories. And so the example that most folks are going to be running is it uses the current date as sort of the prefix for the case, and then the H crew, which is like technically the sort of the site name here, but since it's not a site, it just uses this kind of standard name. And then the comp set is the last part of the case name. So this one is if you download the SP output, you'll get this one here. So that was run back on April 3rd. And then if the plotting script works correctly, it'll generate this plots directory underneath. So the model output files are underneath run. And the plots will be generated here. And so by default, you should get like PNG plots that have the variable name and then underscore all indices, which just means it's plotting the average over the whole domain. And then you can download that or save as something local. And navigate to that. Where did it go? And you should get something that looks like that. So that's plotting the monthly average runoff for the first 10 years of that simulation. So go back to the document here. So that's the output of this.
Okay.
This command here where we're plotting the first 10 years. And I've just told it to output 3 different variables. Of course, there's a lot more than that. If folks are interested, they can look at that list of potential outputs.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can modify the start and end years if you were wanting to plot all 35 years. Oh, looks like I'm stuck in this matplotlib setup, I guess. It hasn't gotten out of that yet. But yeah, you can change some of
It's taking a while.
these parameters and variable names.
And is that plotting like an average over all grid cells in this case?
In this case, so if you tell it index equals -1, so this Python script was originally designed just to look at sort of single grid cell simulations. So I modified it to say if you give it index -1, it will average over all of the grid cells in the simulation, and that'll work for any unstructured grid. But if you know the index of the grid cell that you want to look at, you can change that number. So say you wanted to look at number 30, or you could change that, and then it would plot that corresponding grid cell. So let me try that. Now that it's finished, I'll change that index to 30. And I'll plot the whole time series up to 2014. No. Sorry, that's the old version of OLMT. So let me grab the new. That again. It should just take a minute or two, not even a minute. Okay, so now we go back to this. Does anyone know if I don't know if there's a good way to refresh this view. I always have to just click out of it and then come back in to get a refreshed file list. So I can go back into here where the case we plotted, and we should have this one now, index 30. And we can look at that one. And that's the 35-year time series plot of runoff. I think I picked, yeah, when I was looking at this earlier, 30 was one of the coldest or highest elevation grid cells. So probably with very high snowpack, you see the seasonal pattern of really high runoff.
And so for this like sort of spatialized simulation, if we wanted to plot like a map of GPP over the area or something, I guess would we have to, so you'd have to go into the netcdf output files, I guess, and then also map it back from the unstructured grid into like a lat-lon somehow, I guess.
Yeah,
right?
so it's here in the run directory. Yeah, so there's these 80 files. So these are the sort of native model outputs. 80 is typically monthly. We're also, well, I didn't put them in this download script, but in these runs that we're running now, you'll also get H1 files that have a subset of these variables at daily resolution, which are a bit bigger. But yeah, so if you were to grab one of these files, and you can download them or save them, they are just, you know, all the outputs are in vector form with the 1100 or so grid cells. So that'll be, I guess, more the focus of the next session that
Okay.
Nate and others will lead, and they've got some really nice tools to plot some of these in ELM.
Okay. So is that session going to include like how to remap this stuff back onto like a structured grid, or is that sort of like, is that part of the ELM process?
Yeah, then I can share some code too, but we do, and we do remap it. You can remap it using pandas and Xarray really quickly.
Okay, cool.
You feed in these netcdf files as and create like a pandas data frame. Then you can specify the indices as time, lat, and lon. And then you can use the Xarray constructor from data frame, and it will create a structure grid automatically.
Okay.
But I'll
Cool.
link some code here in just a second to show you how to do that. But the ELM stuff will handle it internally.
Okay, thanks. That sounds really useful.
Yeah, that'll be super helpful. So I grabbed one of those, I downloaded one of those files. So I can, what I'll do is NC dump one of them so you can see some of the metadata that are in there. Oops. So you can sort of see this, the structure of these output history files. So these contain just one on the time dimension. These are monthly average values. But then these dimensions up top, so the number of grid cells is 1175. And so most of the variables, most of these output variables, as you scroll down, will have a time and a grid or land grid dimension. So the corresponding grid cells for those 1175. And I think, yeah, I can't remember the lat lon for each is here. So lon and lat variables. So you can use that information to put it back onto the structured grid if you desired. Yeah, there's also land unit, column, and PFT dimensions. So what you can do, I haven't done it here, but you can ask for the model PFT specific output. So these are grid cell level outputs. So all of that subgrid structure that I talked about before, that's all averaged basically to the grid cell average. But if you have multiple PFTs or multiple land units in a grid cell and you want to be able to see those outputs, you can ask for those. And I can point folks to the relevant OLMT arguments that you would want if you want to see those outputs, but they tend to get quite large. Stop sharing for a sec so I can see folks. Are there any other questions as folks are working through that?
So Dan, I don't know whether I'm the only one who ran into this error, but it says the run names option is not available when I try to run the plot the results of the case you ask us to download.
Yeah, that just happened as I was going through the example here. So every time you start the new container, since I haven't actually updated the container, which would probably be the better way to do this. So you have to go and get the latest version of OLMT each time, so that
Oh, okay. I see.
Instructions there in the middle of number 9, you'll see where you move the old version of OLMT, and then you git clone the latest version.
Yeah, maybe I have skipped that one. Let me try again. Thank you.
And so yeah, it should work if you're in the correct updated version of OLMT.
Okay.
I think also you have to check the plot case command, because it uses the simulation from 4.12 and today is 4.13, so you might have to change the 12 to 13 in there.
That's good to know too.
Yes, if you're plotting the SP case, if you've downloaded that, that's 0403, that you don't have to change that, but just go ahead and change this one here, since I think almost everyone will have today's date. But the default, yeah, I've set it up in those scripts that call OLMT to give the case prefix as the current date. But if you want to change that, you can give it any sort of name you want. But it's a good one way to keep track of things. So let me change that one too. Let me check to see. So the run that I have running has enough data yet. So I'll show an example where we have 2 different runs plotted on the same plot.
Well, it's working for me now after reinstall OLMT.
And I see David had a question there in the chat about how long the runs take. And so these runs, these 35-year runs, will take to complete the full run will take probably, depending on the machine and the number of processors you have, quite a while, like 6 to 12 hours. So obviously we're not going to get that finished here in the hackathon, but you know, if you're able to browse through those outputs, and you can see when you've got 1 or 2 years completed, then we can start to look at some of these plots. And if you're wanting to, so at the end of the document, we've got some additional sort of optional simulations that folks can run. You know, if you want to kill the run that you're doing now so that you can try one of those and make sure it works, that's fine. So under number 10, that step there, there's an example where we modify 2 model parameters, and I'll go through that more in a minute, just to let folks know that it's there. And then there's a second example where the script pulls out 1 grid cell from Faria's surface and domain data and just runs that one. And so that's much faster, obviously, just 1 grid cell instead of 1100. And for that one, that actually goes through the full BGC workflow that I described, which is the 2 steps of spin up and the transient simulation from 1850 to present day. And then there is the link to the list of parameters and output variables at the bottom of step 10. Folks want to take a look at that. G2 says it took him about 8 hours on his laptop, the 35-year BGC run. So I'll try to share again. And what I wanted to try to show here, so I have the modified parameter run running, which is this one, 2023-04-13 new parms. So if you run that example, you should have that prefix. And it's generated a couple of years of outputs. If I can find the right container window, I will try to plot that. That's not the right one either. Can folks see what I'm doing? I think it's this one I want. So in this example, in this plotting example, we're plotting 2 cases. And so there you see the run names that refers to the full name of the case that we've set up, which includes the prefix, site, and comp set. And so for this, the first one is that SP one that we downloaded. And then the second one, I want to look at this new parms example. So if we run that, and then we can just plot maybe 2 years, because I'm not quite sure how much output I have. Hopefully it generated something, so we can go back to the run directory. And so if you're plotting multiple cases, the plots will show up in the last one. So that's this one, where we should have, again, the runoff. And I'm going to do the LAI as well. That's not the right one. So here's the difference in LAI between the 2 simulations. And so the 2023-0403, that's the satellite phenology case. And so that's basically using whatever the satellite observed average annual cycle of LAI is. And Faria, I'm not sure if that's been updated with the high resolution information, or if that's just maybe that just comes from the half degree information. Do you know?
The LAI?
Yeah, the
That
LAI.
was updated with the high resolution data. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So
yeah, we have high resolution data since like 2001 to 2020. So for this workshop, I used 2017 data, but we have like data for every year.
So it's cycling the 2017 average. Yeah.
Right.
So the blue is the observed that's being used to drive the SP version, and then the green is from the BGC version, which is initialized in 1980. So you can see it doesn't have nearly as much of a seasonal pattern as the blue line does, but maybe the mean value isn't too bad. But these are, I think, mainly evergreen forests, right? So it's interesting that there really is so much variation there. But yeah, ELM, if you're running as an evergreen PFT, tends not to change very much seasonally. And then we can look at the runoff. If I did that right. So yeah, so there's 2 years of runoff data. Blue from the satellite phenology again, and green from the new simulation. And I don't know why they look quite different in their seasonal pattern in the second year.
And also like the difference between the runoff is much smaller from the visual, just from this plot compared to the LAI too.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's, I guess maybe the BGC being on or off maybe impacts runoff less than it would LAI.
Mhm.
I think that makes sense.
So it's kind of a ET hasn't changed the runoff that much. Huh?
Right.
That's cool to put two cases all together just in this way. It seems pretty handy for our analysis.
Yeah. And you can do, I don't know if there's a limit, but yeah, you can do multiple cases. If you have 3 or 4 or more, you can put them all in one plot.
Yeah. How about for ensemble simulation? Because when we have, say, 100 realizations, right? Do you have a different function to visualize all of them on one plot, or like we have to hack this to do that job?
Right now, yeah, I think you'd have to hack it. So I haven't gone through that particular workflow. But if you're wanting to run an ensemble, you generally the way we do it is you give it a list of parameter ranges, so min max values for the parameters that you want to vary, and then it'll randomly sample within those ranges to generate an ensemble. And in that case, we do not set up a separate case for every run, just because going through all those steps takes quite a while. And so we set up, the way I do it is I set up one case, generate a run directory, and then basically make a bunch of copies of that run directory and change the parameter file for each one of those. And then OLMT itself has a utility that will manage running all of those single simulations in parallel.
Great. Yeah.
But yeah, I think we could, if folks want to do that, yeah, we could modify a plot case so that it could give us that. So in that case, you might not want to plot 100 lines, you might want to plot a confidence range or something like that.
We just make them very thin, so we're not bothered by the cloud of lines.
Right, or plot the mean as a thick line, maybe.
Yeah.
Stop again for a second and see if there's any concerns or questions as folks are working through.
So then I'm looking at my, simulation window over there. Is it normal to have that window hang around like submit job case.run and then with nothing until it's done?
Yes, it will just, it'll just hang there for a
Okay.
while. But the only,
Okay.
you can look in the output to make sure that it's generating these history files.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
And so I have some new screen output from the terminal part. So after the submit job case.run, I have several 2 lines pop up, check for resubmit out_s force MACH Docker, and then after several lines, submit job case.run again. And when I check the output in the Docker desktop, I can see the latest output is 15 minutes ago. It's in the spin-up. I'm not sure whether it's a new. Probably no new output from the past 50 minutes.
Do you want to share that, or you can stick that in Slack maybe real
Oh,
quick?
yeah, sure.
See, yeah.
It's my desktop.
Not yet.
No. You see it now?
Yes.
Okay, so it's over here. After the submit job case.run, I have these several lines. And then submit the case again. And when I check the output here in the volume, I can see the spin-up has the output, but that's like 15 minutes ago. And you can see the last modified dates, this new output from either of the folders.
But it's generated, it looks like it's generated some outputs. Right.
So first, like, I understand it's a submit job case.run. It's just run the model, but what does this line means? And it's submit again.
I'll look at mine real fast.
Yeah, mine didn't have those lines. Don't know whether there's something different on your input deck or something, Pei Shi.
I'm not sure either. So but I
Did you
did
change anything?
no, I re-download. So the doc version is what I tested for Faria on the Mac several days ago.
Oh, okay.
I did re-download the OLMT from the Git this morning. I can do the plotting part. But when I run it, I have these things. And I can see this output from the spinner. We can see this in that CDF file over here.
Yeah,
But-
so that file list will not refresh automatically. So I usually have to just click away from it and then go back in to see if it updated.
No.
You go ahead and click in there to see if there's anything new output.
Oh yes, there's more.
Yeah, so it is still updating.
But do you know what does these several lines means? Why it has to resubmit the job?
Yeah, I'm not sure why it's doing that. So this is just the default example, right?
Yeah, I'm just running the single cell
That's the
command
single
over.
cell one. Oh, okay.
Yeah, this one. Yeah, anyway.
I can run that one on mine and make sure I don't get the same output there.
Thank you.
So I'm going to open up one of these shell scripts just to walk through some of the things that are in there and what you might want to modify in the future if you're using these. So let me share again. I think this is the right one. And see if I can make that a little bit bigger. Yeah, so this is the default one if you're running the full watershed for the 1980 through 2014. And so in this, we set up the paths for the input data, where the model is located, so where the model code is located. So we're using the E3SM version that was included in the container here, but you could, go out and download your own version and then link that wherever that E3SM directory is. The running case routes are where the output, run route is where the output is being generated. So the output /seam renders, and then it'll create that case name that we were looking at a minute ago. The case route. So when I talked a little bit about seam, it will create that case, and those model configuration files will go in there. So that's sort of all handled by OLMT. But if you're wanting to look at what's in there in terms of the case documentation, it'll be generated there. And then the MP is a number of processors. I don't know, some folks may have had to modify that if you don't have 4 cores available on your machine. If you have more, probably it would involve a little bit of change to the machine configuration to allow running more than 4. I don't know if anyone's tried that yet. And then this is the call to the OLMT command. So it's called global full run.py. And so that's set up for running these regional simulations. There's another one called site_full-run.py. So for running Ameriflux sites, typically we'll use that one instead, which has a lot of the same options. But here you'll see all the arguments, flags that we're passing there. And I've tried to below there explain what all of those mean. Some things aren't relevant to the Docker, but may be relevant on a cluster like wall time if you're submitting to a queue. And then we're in the second and third lines linking these specific surface and domain files that Faria generated for this example. If you have your own, you can generate those kind of offline and then link them here to run those. And then this 5th line here are some specific options that we're passing to ELM. And so we can tell it to run, it's a T-step 1 is an hourly time step. By default, the model will actually run a half-hourly time step. So you can change that here. I typically use an hourly just for these demonstrations because it's twice as fast. And then we're telling it GSWP3 and DayMet4. So that the reanalysis product that we described, and the directory to that metadata path that we've set that up in the input data for this 1 kilometer DayMet data set. The coupler bypass option that I described, you can also use the DATM if you desire, and you can turn off that option. Here we're running without dynamic land use because I don't think we had dynamic PFT information, but if you did have that, you could turn that off and supply a dynamic land use file where the PFTs can change over time. And then this daily runoff I've added as an option to generate this H1 file that I described. And so the default H0 has just the monthly outputs. Daily runoff has some variables associated with runoff in this daily H1 file. And then so if we're running the sort of the full simulation with both phases of spin up, we would not have these two, no AD and no FN. So we're telling it not to do the two phases of spin up here. So it'll just do this transient run starting in 1980 for 35 years with this initial file that's used. So if you were to look in the single point example, those options are not there, and it will run the full set of spin ups. And I can open that one up in a second. And then this is where it defines that case prefix with the current date. But if you're wanting to modify that, you can. There are a number of options that are in global full run and site full run that aren't exercised here, but you can look within the script itself and look at some of those options to see what's available. And I'm happy to answer questions about those because we don't, it's not very well documented at the moment. So if we look at this one where we're pointing to that modification for the parameter file. So it looks pretty much the same except for down here. Hopefully you can see that highlighting. So the -- parm file, and it's pointing to this example file, which is in the same directory here. And so what that'll do is it'll take that file and make the modifications to the netcdf parameter file that's used by ELM automatically. I think that was the only difference there. And so what's in here, basically it's just a text file with the parameter name. And the first column, the plant functional type that we want to apply that to, which is, I think number 2 is the dominant plant functional type, arboreal evergreen in that watershed, and then the new value there, which is 12, and the default is 9. So we're increasing that. And then the second one is the fraction of leaf nitrogen and RUBISCO or FLNR for the same PFT, and we're also increasing that. And so if you're able to run both the default one and this one, make some plots of things like GPP and transpiration, you should see higher values in this simulation with the modified parameters. So any questions on the contents of those scripts? Just hopefully it's a good starting place for folks just to get familiarized with it, and feel free to, experiment with it, make changes, and explore what impacts they might have.
So for the parameter text file, you just show it. So the code basically we're reading the text file and modify the parameter .nc file for ELM to read. Is that right?
Yes, it will do that automatically, assuming you've got a correct name in there. And so it will that modified parameter file, it will put that in the run directory, sort of as a record of what it used. And so that same directory with all of the history output files, you'll see a CLM_params.nc. So you can grab that and verify that it made the change that you expected.
Okay. Another question is, if people want to use ELM, it has to be compiled together with E3SM. Is that right?
Yes.
And that will be a very long process, I guess.
Sorry, what has to be compiled?
Like if people want to use ELM, like the compiling process has to go with the whole E3SM to have the executable for ELM, right?
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
So this
is that a suffering process?
So you're actually doing that as part of this, each time you run one of these shell scripts. So it's going through those processes that process I described at the beginning. So the case creation, so the create new case, there's a setup step for the case, and then there's the case.build, which is essentially compiling all of the E3SM code, or at least the parts of that code that are relevant for running the offline ELM simulation, and then submitting it. So that's all included here. It tends to be pretty fast, I think, for most folks that are working within the Docker framework. I think mine takes about a minute.
So the Docker container itself does not include the E3SM executable. It just have the codes. Well, in this case, it's git clone from a Git repo, and then the global run Python file will compile the executables based on the cases.
Yeah, that's right. So right, it's just the E3SM code base is there, and then each time you run one of these, you'll be building the executable. Yeah, I thought about, we could include a pre-built executable. I think that would work, but since it's quite fast, I think anyway that will.
Yeah, actually, yeah, I suggest the current way, because if people want to use in a HPC system, Docker usually is very hard to use. So it's much easier to, if the compiling process is fast, just like have a Python code is much easier.
Yeah, so I'm hoping to make this process of going through these steps on the Docker as similar as possible to doing it on a cluster, right? So if you're going to run on NERSC, you would go through these same steps where you clone OLMT and point that to, if you've already got E3SM downloaded, you can point to that E3SM directory and then launch this OLMT shell script, and it'll do that. It will automatically submit it to the queue, so it should know if it's on NERSC that it needs to basically do the sbatch command, or well, that's included in the sort of case.submit infrastructure.
Thank you.
So Dan, I wonder, in terms of like changing the parameter values, can you change like multiple parameters in one file, in one PEM file?
Yeah, so the example I showed there, it has two parameter modifications.
Oh, okay.
So you could have as many as you want.
I see. And then like see, what are most commonly changed parameters in ELM? Because in the full list, we have how many? Hundreds and hundreds of parameters, right?
Yeah. It really depends on the problem, like, right, what you're interested in. So there's, when we're doing, we're trying to optimize a model for getting the carbon fluxes right. It's a lot of these leaf level parameters that are really important. So there's the two that are in that file. There's things like carbon nitrogen ratios, allocation constants. If you're more interested in runoff, you might have a different set of parameters. I can point you to a paper that we did a couple of years back with sensitivity analyses.
Mm-hmm.
We were focused on just a few output variables in that case, but it has some information about which parameters tend to be most sensitive for causing variability in those outputs.
Yeah, that would be great. Is that for global scale simulations or a point scale?
It was run at about 100 separate point locations globally distributed.
Great.
Right. So
Thank
yeah,
you.
different plant functional types and different climates.
I see. So in the chat, I think David had some questions, and I don't know whether his problems has been solved or not. If you can take a look, Dan.
Oh yeah. Yeah, David, were you able to get the matplotlib to install?
I guess maybe we can try pip3 instead of matplotlib because this is told in the instruction. Maybe it's using pip3 instead of pip.
I think, yeah, it should be pip3. Make sure I've got that right.
Yeah, in the document it says pip3.
All right, it sounds like it's a proxy issue.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the reasons I'm here, I'm doing this from home today, just to avoid any firewall problems.
We're breaking the PNNL firewall here.
Sounds like Shannon had an issue with getting the PTCLM file. Shannon, have you been able to resolve that?
Let's see, because I did move the old file over, but that doesn't seem to help. Looks like Ben asked. So I did like do my privilege elevation tool, but it like expires in it expired in 15 minutes. I don't know if that reverted it back or not.
I think if you like started Docker with run it as an administrator, then it should stay that way.
Okay.
But I do remember when Verity was testing this out on Windows, I think she ran into issues if you like ever started Docker without running it as an administrator. So that might be one thing to check.
Okay.
Was it able to, if you go and you look in the volume, the input data volume, was it able to get any of the input data? It's just specifically an issue with this PTCLM.
Yeah, I think it's that one, the CLM
Hmm.
file. Yeah, it looked like the other one worked fine.
Yeah, whenever you just copy that line out of the script and just try that one by itself.
Oh, okay.
Maybe we've already done that.
Now I was trying to figure out yeah, I'll try that. Thanks.
Have folks been able to make plots yet?
So,
Yeah.
Dan, a quick question. So, if those high-res run actually stop, at certain years, so how using a Docker, how can we do the restart run?
You mean after the 30 years are complete?
I mean, just maybe stop at 1 or 2 years. So we want just if for some reason stop, how can we do the restart run?
So I think what you would do in, let's see, well, let me share this one more time. This one, right. So yeah, by default, we've told it to run 35 years here. So you could change this number. Say you just wanted to run 5 years. I have to double check and make sure that I think it will automatically generate the restart file at the end, hopefully. And then when that run is finished, you could, you should have a restart file for the year 1985. And so then you'd come in here and you'd modify this run start year to start in 1985.
Yeah.
And run 5 more years. And then you need to put the full path of the initial file, the 1985 restart file here. So change this from 1980. And you can copy it to the same directory, or you can link to the run directory. It doesn't really matter, I think.
Okay, cool. Yeah, just to confirm, yes. Thank you.
Yeah, that should work.
Thanks.
Anything else? So there's also the NERSC Perlmutter versions of these scripts in here if you're wanting to try them out. Really, the only difference is, telling it the machine, which machine you want to run on, the MPI lib and the number of processors. So if you're wanting to run on a single node, you can give it up to 128 processors, and then pretty much everything else except for the paths are the same. And so that if you run this, it will automatically submit the job to the queue. You can monitor that. And when it's, I think when we were running these 128 processors, it was taking less than an hour to run. Should be relatively quick. And then there's the sort of the full run version for the full spin up UDC PM, right? Which if you run this, it'll run those all three cases again automatically. So they'll submit 3 jobs to the queue. The second one will be dependent on the first one, and the third one will be dependent on the second one. So they'll run in order, and then all 3 cases should be finished. And I don't remember how long this one took, but this is what we use to generate the restart file that you're using here today. So the 2023-0403. I think it just takes a few hours to do that full simulation.
Yeah, thanks.
And you can modify this for other machines, assuming that you've got E3SM up and running on it.
So Dan, if we run ensemble simulations on NERSC machines, do you submit separate jobs, or like you combine all these realizations into one job to submit?
So yeah, it combines it all into a single job.
Okay.
It can, so the way that it's set up, right? So it's setting up this run directory for each ensemble member. It generates an enormous number of files, right? Because each one of those is writing history outputs. And so we need to be a little careful about not trying to do too many at once, because it might bog down the IO, and it'll be less efficient, and it may impact the whole system. So you can run up safely like a few hundred at a time. That's what I typically do.
Okay, a few hundred is fine.
A few hundred is. But so that is for single grid cell simulations, though. Right now we don't have a good way to launch ensembles of multiple grid cell type jobs, because it's an MPI job trying to launch another one. So I haven't. That doesn't work very well. So I haven't figured that one out yet. But there are other ways to launch ensembles of regional simulations that we could talk about.
Okay, we'll follow up later. Thanks.
So what I'm hoping, I guess, or what we might want to use as an input for the next session in 2 weeks, right? Like if you want to try to run this default simulation, let it run the full 35 years overnight or something, and then you could try running another one if you want with some modification. I think that might be a nice starting set of outputs that you could use. I don't know if before we run out of time, if Nate, you or someone wants to say something a little bit more about what's coming next.
Yeah, certainly. So Next time, we'll be talking a lot about ILAM and benchmarking. Some of that will be kind of an overview of historically what ILAM has been. But just glancing at the names, I know many of you are familiar with that already. So it'll be kind of similar to Dan's covering of ELM. We'll show you a little bit about what ILAM has been in the past, and then show you some things that we've worked on for kind of watershed scale science. And then we'll also kind of cover how you can use ILM tools to make plots and things out of these, out of the results that you're running right now. So we'll cover all of that. Not sure yet if we're gonna teach you to copy the data locally, or we'll do it in the Docker container. Well, now that I have some output, I'll test and see which way we go.
So I think for next next session, we may or may not have exactly the same overlapping group. So we may start with some output files that we may ask everyone to download, just so that the folks that are not here today to have data sets to work with. And just to kind of add on to what Nate was talking about, so that the next session we will focus on evaluation of watershed models in general. So today we focus primarily on ELM, but during the next session we'll also touch upon other watershed models that most of us within in this community are working with. So we'll touch on not just on ELM simulations and evaluation of those ELM simulations, but also bringing in data simulation outputs from models like ATS. We'll have few examples to know how to bring in models like SWOT or National Water Model, and how do we kind of integrate it all within ILM framework for a full multi-model comparison. So we'll try to sort of have a series of hands-on examples for everyone to learn, and some examples just to sort of highlight the capabilities that we can continue to use and work on. Could be of interest to a lot of, and I know that we have several folks here that have interest on the more on the data side. And I think next week we'll touch a lot on how do we bring in these data sets for the comparison purposes as well. And I think probably we'll leave some questions about how do we integrate some of the more BER and the centric data centers, and how to bring those particular data sets in within ILM framework. And hoping those examples that we'll talk about next week we'll start some discussions.
Sounds good.
Thank you, G2 and Nate, for that additional info too. So Dan, is there anything you want to conclude like our today's session in the last 4 minutes?
No, hopefully, hope this has been useful for folks, and feel free to reach out if you run into any issues, or if there's capabilities you want to explore that we didn't touch on today. And I definitely want to thank again the folks that put this Docker implementation together for the NG Arctic workshop last fall. So Ben, you and Rich and Sean Serban and others that I've listed there in the document. So this has been really helpful, and I've used it a lot in my own sort of model development as well, especially for, I think it's good for these regional simulations, even though it's quite slow, and it gives us a test bed that on the big machines, it's often hard to get time, or you sit in the queue for a day and then, you don't remember what you've done. So this gives us a sort of a rapid feedback that's, I think, really helpful in the model development cycle.
Thank you, Dan, and everyone who have contributed to this session. I myself found it really useful to learn what we can do with ELM and how to make that happen. on different systems. We definitely look forward to the next session. We build on this. And then the other thing is, this is the starting of the sessions we can help to put together with, like, say, contribution from our community. If you have other tools, models you want to learn and wonder how to get started, you might also send us some feedback so we can see whether we can put together the resources and people to launch some other similar sessions like this. And if you have any specific feedback on how we can make this more effective for you to learn and master the tool, we are open to your suggestions too. So I don't know whether Forrest, you are back yet?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I can hear you, but I cannot see you.
Okay.
I just want to say, big thanks for you to put together all the logistics together too. So now your time to have the parting words for the
Yes.
team.
So what I was going to say about logistics is that I think we have everybody now signed up on Slack, and they should be using the MDI hackathons channel in the Slack workspace. If you're not there, let me know. We recorded today's session, so we'll make that recording available somewhere on YouTube and point everybody to it. So in case some people missed or couldn't be here today or had to run away from their screens or something, that information will be there. And to remind people about Slack, that you can ask questions sort of anytime over the next week if you are going to do some more simulations, or you want to try those single point BGC simulations and you run into issues or whatever. Somebody will see your message, even if some people have trouble with notifications, and get you some answers. So we want to continue that. And then just to sort of wrap up and expand a little more on what Xingyuan was saying, we've both thought a lot about also doing webinars. So it's we like this kind of hackathon format for stuff that we can do, but if there are things that you're also interested in, but maybe it's not something that we can do as a hackathon, or not tools necessarily that everybody's ready to use, we could also invite people to give us webinars on various topics, methods, tools, techniques, or whatever. So please suggest those as well, because we want to try to, bring the latest technology to everybody's hands in the work that we do.
Yeah. Well, you please volunteer yourself to lead a session or discussion too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, with all that, Forrest, I guess we will give Dan and Faria another big round of thanks, and then thank you for everyone who came today, and we hope to see you again in our future sessions too. Thank you all very much.